I'd like to thank everyone for coming today to the Mixed Method webinar series brought to you in part by the Mixed Methods International Research Association as well as the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology. My name is Yvette and I'll be your host for today. Our presentation is illustrating the purposes for using mixed methods research approaches with examples from popular media with presenter Dr. Elizabeth Creamer.
Thank you. Do you want me to get started, Yvette?
Sure. I'll just put up
All right. You will pull up the PowerPoints? Yes, here they come. All right. Slowly. Okay, slowly. Whoops, we need to go back. All right, I guess I'm on, right? People can hear me. Yvette, you can hear me?
Yep, you can go. You're good to go.
All right, I'm good to go. Well, I'm real glad to be here with you today. We've got kind of a small group right now. We've got about 10. So we may be able to get some interaction going, which would be good. I will keep this under 50 minutes. 60 minutes, even if I have to get kind of speedy toward the end. So let me tell you my goals today. They're fairly introductory in terms of mixed methods. I want to define and illustrate some of the classic purposes that are given for using a mixed methods approach. And sometimes I find that when I do that, people can think about their own projects and think how they fit within these purposes, or sometimes they fit across purposes. So while I'm talking about these things, I hope you'll be thinking about a particular project or several projects you have in mind, either that you've done or maybe thinking about doing. I like to use two kinds of examples. I don't always want to be a stuffy academic, although I'm definitely a stuffy academic. I am always struck by examples from popular media, particularly from the natural and social sciences. So some of the examples I'm going to give come from outside of education or outside of health, and they're, I think, kind of whimsical examples, sometimes a little bit quirky. And then in the end, toward the end, everyone is always wondering about how exactly do you mix and how is that maybe linked to the purpose of your study. So I'm going to give some quick examples, 3 examples, just to show this is how mixing is done because it's so central to the definition of mixed methods research. Your takeaways is to think about your own study, as I said, and to think about a label and the benefits of using a label that is used frequently in the literature. So finding a label for your own study, and then to begin to think about ways that you might be able to mix. So Yvette gave you a brief introduction about me. I'll just say 1 or 2 things more. I've been teaching mixed methods courses since 1995 when Creswell first started to talk about turning the story. That's what he talked about first in 1995. My leaning is more qualitative than it is quantitative, and it grows increasingly so. So I think you'll see that emphasis in my own framing of this. And Yvette mentioned my new book that just came out in the spring, even though it has a 2018 date, called An Introduction to Fully Integrated Mixed Methods Research, which, needless to say, I'm very excited about. Let me offer a definition of mixed methods. This is not a classic or standard definition, but it embraces some of the key parts of it, and I think adds something that is really the direction that mixed methods is going. So most people see at the core of the definition of mixed methods research the idea of the collection and analysis of both qualitative and quantitative data. Boom, that's number 1 part of the definition of mixed methods research. Central to that definition is the idea that both the qualitative and quantitative strands will be meaningfully linked or integrated in some way. And I add the emphasis with the expectation to engage multiple perspectives, because I think it's really valuable to think about mixed methods not simply for confirmation, which is a traditional way of thinking about it, but I think it's helpful to to frame your thinking that the qual and the quant part of a mixed method study will tell different stories, and that there's a lot of excitement and theoretical potential in those differences. So I joined my high school friend Jennifer Green in emphasizing the idea of mixed methods as engaging, being quite deliberate about engaging multiple perspectives. I mentioned my book, an introduction to fully integrated mixed methods of research. In that book, I use the architectural arch, to illustrate and to emphasize, particularly with that keystone there at the top, right here. Let me see if I can get that little green right here. This is called a keystone, with the idea that there is the intent to bring the two strands, to bring the qualitative and quantitative strands together in meaningful ways. Otherwise, the multi-method label is more appropriate. The arch really emphasizes the way that integration has been thought about historically since the advent of mixed methods in the 1990s. And that is sort of delegating or relegating mixing to something that occurs at the conclusion stage. I like to think about it in a broader way that includes mixing during the traditional way of mixing during conclusions and inferences, but also that emphasizes at the design phase through the construction of research questions, during data collection, sometimes in sampling, the way sampling is constructed, and most importantly, during analysis. This is the piece that has really been given the least attention, but now people are really switching to emphasize that. Pat Baisley, a leader in the field, is coming out with a new book that the whole book is about mixing during analysis. Now, by no means is it necessary to mix at all phases to be considered mixed methods research. It's just there is the potential to mix at all phases, and that's what I'm emphasizing with the idea of fully integrated. So I'm going to organize my talk in two parts. First, as I said, I'm going to give you some characteristics of the major rationales and one example from the popular media and a second from the academic media. And at different points, I'll ask you questions to see, does anyone's study fit into this? Does anyone's study seem to fit into this? And you can put those comments in the chat. Also, by the way, if you have questions as you go, pop them right in that chat box, and I'm happy to answer them as we go along. I find it's better to ask them as you go along, otherwise you might forget them. So these are the titles of the traditional rationales that are given from using mixed methods research. These come from a classic, some would call it seminal piece by Green, Caricelli, and Graham from 1989. People still use this language. People still find it extremely helpful, and it is woven throughout the mixed methods literature, and it's a way for you to connect with the mixed methods literature. Let me talk first about probably the most, in some fields, the principal reason for using mixed methods. And that is what's called the triangulation design. And it is really essentially to enhance the validity or reliability of data about the same construct when qual and quant data about the same construct corroborate each other. Now, this is actually a little bit more complicated to achieve than you might expect because qual and quant are so different. But you'll see this as a very, very classic rationale once the original rationale for mixed methods. So this is really a tried and true rationale. The example from the popular media that I like to give of this comes from some work at the very recent work at the University of Leeds by an interdisciplinary team to uncover the bones of Richard II. Richard II was a king of England, featured in a play by Shakespeare where he was described as a hunchback. And he was not a very popular king, according to legend. And he was also apparently a bit brash or rash, as he dashed off in the middle of battle and got very carried away, apparently, and dashed into the battlefield where he was knocked off his horse and died on the battlefield from multiple wounds. And he was so unpopular that he was dumped, the only king to be dumped, into an unmarked grave where he has remained for almost 500 years. So he's been in this unmarked grave for 500 years, and many a fortune hunter has tried to discover these bones. But an academic team took a little more systematic approach, and they used multiple sources of data to pinpoint the location of his grave. I believe it was in 2016. So it's a very recent discovery. They took documents from the era, journals, letters, newspaper articles, and identified passages that mentioned the location of the grave. They graphed it to old maps. They converted old maps to new maps and GPS coordinates, and then they ran a multiple regression. So they took qual data from qualitative documents, turned it into numbers, GPS coordinates. They popped those GPS coordinates in a regression equation, and they discovered his bones underneath a parking lot, and they came within a foot of finding it. So they zeroed in and were able to locate his bones. You'll see from this picture of his bones that he was not the hunchback that he was portrayed to be, but actually had a pretty severe case of scoliosis. And if you look carefully, you can begin to see some of his many wounds from this. So this is an example of using qual and quant to enhance validity for triangulation purposes. The example from a more academic side is one of the exemplars I use in my book by Theory et al. And this is a study of the undergraduate research experience. And you can see right in their purpose statement the sort of orientation, the purpose of trying to triangulate their data, to triangulate their survey and interview data to build up the credibility of their findings. The second design is classic design, used a lot in business and in other fields, is called the development design. This clearly is a two-phase design, and it's undertaken for two purposes. In a classic sense, the two-phase design is used for survey development. Phase one might be qualitative interviews. Phase two would be the construction of an instrument. Phase three would be the implementation and analysis of that instrument. The development design is also used for sampling purposes. Perhaps you have quant data to pick a qual sample, and you'll see that in a minute. I get a huge kick out of this example of the development design, and this is a picture of my webpage, Mixed Methods Research in the News, where I cover or have a little synopsis of this little article that's called Doggie Smarts. And this illustrates the development design. So at Yale University, you'll see right here, Yale University, they have created a center for the study of canine cognition. They're trying to develop a measure of dog intelligence. You know, the many ways that dogs are used, for instance, to find bombs, to help people who are ill, and of course for the blind. Look at this picture and you'll see that the dog is pointing his nose or her nose on the left and is picking item on the left. Well, what they did in this particular study, two-phase, first phase, classic qual phase, they interviewed owners of dogs who thought their dog was brilliant. And then they ask the owners to identify, what does the dog do that makes you think it's smart? And what does the dog do that makes you think it's not smart? And then they developed experimental measures to test the dog's intelligence. And on this website, you can see some of the experimental strategies they use to measure dog intelligence. I love that example. Cooper, also an exemplar in my study, used for one phase of her research project, and this was a dissertation, used information that was gained about engagement and levels of engagement in the classroom to pick a very purposeful sample for case studies. This is a beautiful, beautiful mixed methods design. So quant data is used to pick a purposeful sample, in this case, an extreme case sampling, to pursue further different ways that engagement was promoted in the classroom. So this is a super, super study. All right, so I'm going to give you a little quiz here. You can answer in the chat box. So there's 12 of you. Let's see if I get 12 answers in here. So get ready to type. What is this picture best describe of the two things I've talked so far? A triangulation design or a development design? So type that in. Let's see some answers here. I feel like I'm on a quiz show or something. Aha! Kelly's in there first with development design. Kelly happens to be right. Kelly's right. Here you're picking, you've used the either quant, generally it's quant data to pick a smaller sample. That's a great example of a development design. All right, stay tuned. The complementary design is the broadest umbrella for mixed methods designs, and the one that is used most frequently. I imagine that many of you have studies that fall in this under this category. Language associated with the complementarity design is the purpose to develop a more comprehensive picture. And usually that means that the qual data involve certain constructs and the quant data involve other constructs, but they're related. They're related in important ways. The example that I use for this one is called Blue Zones, and it's a massive supported by a massive project supported by the National Geographic. It originally started out as an academic study to identify populations where an unusually high percentage of people live to be over 100. So they used demographic quantitative data to identify those locations. And they started first with this location in Italy. So they used those data to figure out where these people live, and later they expanded the study to other places in the world, but they started in Italy. And then they sent an interdisciplinary team of people in to interview the people about their lifestyles, about their eating patterns. They examined the botany in the area. And you're probably familiar with the results. They discovered you need to drink a little wine and eat some nuts and olives and olive oil and go light on the meat. And it is subsequently turned into eating programs or designs for eating programs in the United States. So this has really had some terrific broad-scale implications. An example of a study with a complementarity purpose is by Mazzola et al., who studied stress in graduate students. Some of you may know something about that. And they used the quant data to get levels of stress and amount of stress. But first they used qual interviews to figure out sources of stress. So they're linked and create a more comprehensive picture. So that's the language you want to see associated with complementarity. One of my favorite designs is the least used design. And sometimes it helps for me to talk about it because sometimes people have data sitting on the shelf somewhere that they don't know what to do with and could be used in a study that would be framed with the initiation rationale. The initiation rationale, as conceived by Green, Caricelli, and Graham, is the deliberate intent to pursue contradiction or absences in the data. Contradiction would be the all too frequent occurrence when qual and quant data are contradictory, and people pursue it generally in a second study, or sometimes it is a study is framed initially with the expectation that, say, samples in two schools or samples in two settings are going to be very different, and there's the deliberate interest in pursuing that contradiction. Sometimes the contradiction is an absence in data. So maybe a theoretical model is saying you should find this, but you don't find this. Or say you find it in one group of students or one group of patients, but you don't find it in another. And you set out to try to understand that. That's what's known as an initiation rationale. Gasson and Waters, an exemplar in my book, have a wonderful grounded theory study where they were looking at online data about online participation in discussion groups. And they were really interested in the students who were not the thought leaders, not the ones who were very active in the discussion boards. And they were interested in trying to understand that do those people learn as much as the discussion leaders? And in fact, it turned out they did. So it's a great example of an initiation rationale. An ambitious rationale is called the expansion or multi-level rationale. Again, this is one that it has some distinct characteristics, and it's called multi-level because the researcher is collecting data from multiple levels of an organization, a school, for instance, or a business. So they might be collecting data, say, from teachers, principals, parents. Those data rarely coincide. It could also be about nurses and patients, nurses and patients and families. That's necessarily multi-level. Sometimes you may use a survey with some part of that population and an interview with others. Very common design associated with evaluation research. An example, I don't have a popular media example, but Zhang et al. Is a wonderful example of a dissertation that used a multi-level design. And she was interested in students, principals, and teachers' views about what is effective leadership. And does effective leadership vary by school and context? And these were all high-risk schools and high-risk environments. So it was really effective leadership in high-risk environments. So engaging the differences in perspectives is really also embedded in a multi-level design. So as you think about your own study, in a second I'm going to ask you to sort of say if any of these designs fit the study you're considering. So follow Kelly's example before and type in the chat box if it fits, if any of the labels I have used fit, or if you feel like maybe yours cover two of these categories. So let me summarize them again. The triangulation design doesn't really have, or triangulation purpose, it doesn't have, it's generally two-phase. Sometimes those phases are conducted simultaneously and sometimes sequentially. but usually the focus is on one construct. You have qual and quant data about the same constructs, and you want to see if they corroborate or confirm each other. That's triangulation. You're interested in this because of validity and reliability issues. The complementarity example, I called it complementarity here, but it's actually complementarity, was the blue zone example. Normally, multiple constructs are measured, qual for some, quant for others, but they don't necessarily have to be different. The goal here always is to create a more comprehensive picture. This is the most common example. Development is pretty easy to pick out because it's two phases, generally conceived as to design a survey instrument, sometimes for sampling purpose, but clearly has two phases. It's sequential because the second phase is dependent on the first. And that's what the word sequential means. It's dependent on the first. You couldn't get to the second phase without the first phase. And so the development design is clearly sequential. Initiation is rarely used. It's about 2 or 3% of the total mixed methods articles, but it has tremendous potential in terms of theory development. I recently wrote an article about it, and almost all of the examples actually used it to develop theory. It can follow many different designs, but its goal is to understand and pursue contradictory data, not necessarily to reconcile them. Expansion, I'm going to put expansion and evaluation research and multi-level research all in one little bucket. Usually, almost always, these involve getting data from multiple people at multiple levels of an organization. It's usually done sequentially. It's usually a combination of survey instruments and qualitative data, which offers some real opportunities to integrate the data. So take a second now and use that chat box, and let's see if you'll type in the chat box if you've got a study in mind. I'm going to give you a few minutes here. Let's see what types of purposes you think fit the studies that you have had in mind, or that you've done, or that you're doing at this time. So let's see what kinds you do. Let's see if you match the normal models. I'll wait a second here. We'll see what you can type in. It takes a minute to refresh, I imagine. Good, I see some people are typing. Good, good. I wish I could hear more about these studies. At least in an expansion. This is great. Thank you. Yep. See, quite a few are showing development. Some are even showing the recognizing that you signal. One has got a development design that starts with qual, but it's not dominant, and is showing the right way to describe that. So the qual is in lowercase letters and the quant is in larger case letters. The development design is done, a number of you have that. Its beauty is that it's quite self-contained. It's quite manageable. Even though it can be 2 phases or 3 phases, it's manageable. Um, some of you, 2 of you, I think, have both development and complementarity. So starting with qual to develop a tool and then moving on to other phases to get a more comprehensive picture. That's a very nice combination. That's a very nice combination. One is doing expansion. I only see one doing expansion. That's Kelly. Multiple levels of the organization. Of course, there's nothing prevents that from being done simultaneously. So we got 2 doing development and complementarity. So probably starting out to design and develop an instrument and then applying it to get a more comprehensive look. So these labels may be helpful to you to describe your work. In some recent work by Judith Schulenbaum, she proposes that you can consider these, since these are really related to why you are mixing, your purpose for mixing. She suggests that, as some of you have found, that you could really use these purposes to describe each phase of the research project, if that may work better sometimes than using them to describe the overall purpose of the project and why it's mixed methods. So these rationales get to the issue of why you are mixing, what is the intent of mixing, and how that is related to your purpose. So these are great. Let me move ahead and talk to a couple kinds of examples of mixing. And then I think we're going to have a good 10 minutes for questions. So I hope you have some good questions for me, and Yvette will run that part of it. Many people struggle with imagining how you mix. And in some cases, it's mixing and analysis, and in some cases, it's not mixing and analysis. It's mixing, say, in data collection. So for instance, in the development design, the 2 phases are linked. And that is the type of mixing that occurs. You've got a qual phase to maybe design the instrument, and then a quant phase where you administer the interview. But those 2 are linked. They're linked. The data collection is linked. So that's one kind of analysis. Let me show you 3 ways that mixing can occur. Now this one, I'm going to link to the triangulation purpose and a type of table that is called a joint display in mixed methods. Tony Omuguzi has written about joint displays, among others. And this is also sometimes called a truth table. And in it, people line up this. Let me see if I can get that one. They compare quantitative variables on the same construct and qualitative data. So for instance, in this table, this is from Shim, who has done some research about dance therapy. She's done some very good research about dance therapy, and she has a 2017 article about that. And here she's got her qualitatively derived themes and quotes. And here she has a quant variable from one of her instruments that seems to mirror this. And in this joint display, she identifies whether those 2 variables are congruent, if the results are congruent or incongruent. And in this case, she finds them all congruent, even though one of them really was not significant. So I would have said that this one was incongruent. But in this case, she's really underscoring this triangulation purpose, because she's saying, hey, look, my qual and my quant data, my quant variables support the qualitatively derived variables. So I don't know whether this should be called mixing during analysis, or whether it's mixing during the inference stage. I think it's really mixing during analysis. but it reinforces this idea, look, they corroborate or confirm each other. Um, some people will take qual variables and then pick items from an instrument to represent those variables if they have administered an instrument to a group of people. So they can use these to construct variables or factors out of a quantitative instrument. So there are several takeoffs of this joint display or truth table. A really nice match, but sometimes people find it ambitious to the complementarity purpose, is the development of a grounded theory model using mixed methods approaches. This research and these footnotes, the citation is in the footnotes, comes from a wonderful article that was a dissertation by Kawamura, a Japanese person who's active in mixed methods. And she developed this wonderful grounded theory model where she uses different shading to do ovals to show her qual data, rectangles to show her quant data, and then she uses sort of the rounded corner to refer to when she has both qual and quant data that supports it. In some versions of this, people highlight, like they put an asterisk or something that shows that they have both qual and quant data. But here she's using it by having these sort of rounded boxes to say that she has, like here, frequency of training in the program was derived from both qual and quant data that are congruent. The other thing that's super cool about this figure that I'm saying fits the complementarity purpose, because it's certainly developing a more comprehensive picture, is notice that she has showing relationships that are qual derived and quant derived. So she uses this symbolism to say the qual data supports a relationship here, and she uses the dark arrows to show that these two are related. She has quant data that shows the relationship between these data. So essentially she has inputs, she has outcomes, so it's a linear model that goes this way, and she's showing graphically and visually how they fit together to create a whole model, the qual and quant pieces. So this is just a wonderful piece of work. It appeared in the International Journal of Multiple Research Approaches. Finally, I mentioned already that, and by the way, let me go back. This is mixing during analysis. So she's showing mixing during analysis here by these arrows, for instance. This is mixing during analysis. Mixing at the design phase, you see, and I've already talked about this, is simply linking when two phases are linked. They're clearly linked. As I said, they're sequentially linked. One phase is not possible without the other. For example, in the sampling design, if you use quant data to pick case studies, a wonderful design, you couldn't do it without the quant data. It's linked. Sometimes those data may not be used again except to pick the sample, but that is still mixing. It's mixing at data collection, it's mixing at design. So those are three examples of different ways to mix: the joint display, the creation of a final model. This happens to be a theoretical grounded theory model, but it could be a much more narrowly defined model. That's mixing during analysis. And finally, linking through the development design. So let's shift now to wrap up and then get your questions here. So a couple concluding thoughts about labels. So why is a label important? The label can generate ideas about how you can use mixed methods, perhaps with a data set you already have, perhaps with a study you already have in mind. So it can generate ideas about studies. It can help you decide if it's helpful to characterize your research as mixed methods. It can confirm the idea that, yeah, I think it is mixed methods because look, it fits under these purposes. So that's number two. Number three is the idea of linking to language that is used by mixed methods people and providing you a very concise way to communicate the purposes of your mixing. It also helps you be explicit about your reasons for mixing, which is absolutely essential to a mixed methods audience. And then finally, I'd say that using the labels when you cite appropriately really helps to build for your credibility as a mixed methods researcher. So using some of the classic research in mixed methods helps you in citing it in your papers and presentations, helps you build your credibility as having expertise in mixed. A couple mentions here of supplemental reading. Bryman did some more investigation of these 1989 typologies. So this is an interesting article. And then a little very amateur YouTube I have about defining mixed methods, and it's linked to the arch. So let's go back to the concluding thoughts. And now it's 3:43, so we're right on target. I hope you will shoot out some questions to me in the chat box, and Yvette will read some of those out, and maybe we'll find a way to, I don't know if we'll unmute people, but let's hear questions you might have as we wrap this up. A couple of you are typing. Let's see.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So as Elizabeth mentioned, if you do have access to a microphone, you want to put your hand up, we can try to give you a microphone if you want to ask your question in person. If not, you can go ahead and type your question into the chat and we can read those out.
So there's two different ways to do it. You can put your hand up by clicking on the hand icon, which is in the top bar, or you can type a question. All right. The first question I have a question. In my research, I require both qual and quant data for my building tool, then quant for its evaluation. How does that fit in the models you describe? So I have both qual and quant data for building my tool, then quant for its evaluation. I am guessing that the purpose here, and this again, I want to underscore that you're really like trying to pick the best purpose. If the evaluation is for confirmatory, primarily for purposes of confirming your tool, the usefulness of your tool, then the triangulation design may be most helpful for you. If not, you might want to raise your hand and tell me a little more about this study. And he's saying yes or she's saying yes. So that may be if it's primarily confirmation, then you would say that the triangulation design, it fits a classic purpose of the triangulation design. So you'd say the major purpose for mixing is to fit the purpose of triangulation. Tina says, I work with doctoral students doing mixed methods research, and your language and explanations were and will be helpful. Thank you, Tina. That's cool. They really have proved useful to me over time. They're understandable. They're portable across settings, so I find them quite useful as well. So Lori says, my development is not for instrument develop. I'm beginning with Quan to determine my sample selection and to provide information about the cases. And Lori, that's a great design. It is a development design. You're using the quant to pick your cases, and then you're going to also weave the quant into your cases. So when you think about the construction of the cases, you're right in calling it also having complementarity, because in the cases it's going to add to the complexity or add to the breadth of the cases. And often case studies, they lend themselves to mixed methods, so that phase is also mixing, because you're mixing in the construction of a case study, which is a type of analysis, and then you do the cross-case comparison. So to say that you have both a development and a complementarity purpose works very well. It works very, very well. So sometimes you have two purposes there. All right. What other questions might you have? All right. Anyone else got a...
Yeah, looks like we have a question from Simon Turman. How would you consider surveys using both qual and quant?
How would you consider surveys? Is the question, how would you consider a survey that has, oh, I see, both qual and quant? I recognize that name, by the way, I believe from the Japan conference, if I'm not mistaken. Surveys often have both qual and quant. So talking out loud a little bit here, usually the quant are considered the close-ended questions, and the qual can be open-ended. So there's two ways to think about it. If you're viewing these as confirmatory, in other words, then your purpose would be triangulation. But if you're really trying to add new variables or new understanding, perhaps your quant questions come mainly from the literature, and you're hoping from the qual to identify some new variables or new constructs. In other words, you're going to actually analyze your qual questions using an emergent approach, and you hope to develop some new variables. Then I would say, you could say that you have both a triangulation and complementarity purpose. Or you could weigh, what's my prime purpose? And I really want to communicate to the audience that my purpose here was to see if the two jived? Or really, if you want to emphasize that your purpose is to get some new constructs, some new variables that may not be in the literature, then I would think the complementarity label is most appropriate. Great question. That's a really exciting idea. All right. Here, oh, Lori put, have you seen any other interesting visual methods for merging data? Because I'm looking at the interrelationship of one construct, type of school setting, and another construct, math pedagogical practices in specific school cases. I'm struggling with this. So I'm interested in other ways of visualizing the merging of data. Let me think about this in addition to the visual model that I showed. I'm looking for the interrelationship of one of the constructs and another construct. You might, Lori, be able to extract something from this particular figure. And as I said, this can be broken down into parts. Here they've got outcomes, for instance, and here you've got what's called conditions in grounded theory. But if you narrowed it down to show the relationship between variables, this particular part of the model might be helpful to you as a visualization. If you put your email in the chat, Lori, I will send you some other examples on email. I can't pull them up right here, but if you add your email in the chat, I'd be glad to send you some other. Let me think about it a little bit, and I'll see if I can pull up some other examples. I have quite a repertoire. All right, so just put your email in there, and I'd be happy to do that. If anyone else has something they would like to email me about, let me give you my email. It's Creamer E, so it's my last name and first initial, CREAMERE @vt.edu. There's Lori's email. I'll email you. I'm happy to answer emails, or just you can send me a question separately as you think about things afterwards. I'm happy to answer emails. All right, Yvette, I don't think I see any more questions. Do you?
No, I think that's it. Does anyone else have any last minute questions? We do still have a little bit of time left. Does anyone have anything burning to get off their minds? Okay, just a couple announcements then. Next month we will be having the final Mixed Methods webinar for this year. You can registration for that will be up on our website within the next day or so, and that's Cheryl Pop, doing mixed methods research, complexity, dilemmas, and opportunities. And her webinar is scheduled for Tuesday, November 14th at 1 p.m. So we'll hopefully see all of you there. And if no one has any more questions, I guess we'll maybe end a little bit early today. Elizabeth, did you have any final words or closing statements?
No, I enjoyed it. Thank you so much for being here. I hope some of you will email me and send me some good questions, but this was a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
And thank you very much for presenting. And thank you all for attending. Your support is very much appreciated for the Mixed Methods webinar series. As part of a series offered by IIQM and Mira, support, like having people like you attend, makes it possible for us to put on these webinars. So we hope to have your continued support. And with that, I think we'll end there. So everyone take care, and we'll hopefully see you at a future event.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.